We are continuing along in the laws of Basar b'chalav. We are in Siman Peiches, chapter 88. We are beginning a new section of halacha in terms of the restrictions on when certain types of food may be brought to the table. We are going to look at when you may have meat and cheese, okay, or specifically when you may have fleishik products and milchig products on your table together. You're obviously not eating them together. So the question is when you may have them on the same table if two people are eating something differently. We don't want you to have you reaching from one to the other. So the name of the section is actually called that one may not place both meat on the same table upon one which is eating cheese, but this will apply to both meat and dairy products as we shall see. So the first halacha in this one is if Aleph. The Shulchan Aruch says, "Afilu basar chayav of asr lahaloso al shulchan she'ochal alav gvina." Even the rabbinic ones, like meat from venison, meaning from like deer and those type of animals. So it's not beef. Okay, we talked about that in the middle of Siman Pei Zayin, and also fowl, like chicken. One may not bring them onto the same table upon which one is eating cheese. And the Shulchan Aruch continues, Shelo yavo la'achlam yachad, aval b'shulchan soder alav hatavshil mutuliten zeh b'tzad zeh. The problem with having them on the same table upon which you are eating is a problem because you are having them on a table upon which you are eating, and you may come to eat them together. However, if you're simply organizing the pots to go out, one may put one right next to each other. So on a countertop, for example, one may put a meat food and a dairy food on the countertop next to each other, even if they're right up against each other. So we see over here a prohibition on eating these items with other people together. So let's look into this question, whether it's permitted to have meat and dairy on one table. So the Mishnah is the one that cites the source, the Mishnah Chulin, on page 103, okay, Kuf Gimel Amud Beis. It says, all meat is prohibited to cook with milk. Okay, we've seen this Mishnah before, except for the meat of fish and locusts, okay, Dagim v'chagavim. And then the Mishnah continues, V'azah halos im hagvina al hashulchan, chutz v'sar dagim v'chagavim. And then we also say, not only can you not cook them together, you also can't put them on the same table together. So Rashi says, what is this prohibition of putting on the same table? So you might come to eat them together, okay? Because they're going to come and touch each other and swallow them together, right? You'll touch them together and swallow them, even though it technically is permitted to eat meat after cheese, as the Gemara will explain. Okay, he doesn't say the other way around, which we'll get to another time. That's a different section of halacha. So the Gemara says the following. So Rav Yosef makes the following statement: learn from our Mishnah that meat that comes from fowl and dairy are a Torah prohibition. Because if it was rabbinic, I am eating them together is making one level of an enactment, making one gezerah. Gezerah is an enactment. So now we're going to make another layer of restrictions. So you're saying I can't eat them together, and now you're going to say I can't have them together on the table. So here, the Gemara continues. It says, if you put fowl and cheese on the same table, you're going to then put meat and cheese on the same table, and then you're going to eat basar b'chalav as a Torah prohibition. So what we're saying is now, in the Gemara's understanding, is that I'm making only one enactment to prevent you from eating true Torah level basar b'chalav. So the Gemara says, I don't like that. Rav Sheshes disagrees. He says, at the end of the day, everything's cold, and so that's not a Torah prohibition. So Abaye says, no, it's a prohibition that is enacted because you might come to put them into a hot pot together. Well, okay, so if it's a hot pot and it's at the table, then it's what's called a kli sheni, meaning you've taken stuff off of the fire, you've put it into a bowl, and you slap them together in a bowl. That's not a Torah prohibition. Because a kli sheni ain't a mavashel, right? Because a second container isn't cooking. Cooking is only in a first container and it's on the fire. But if you pour it into a second container, that's not cooking. So the Gemara settles on, all right. So you might throw them into the pot on the fire. So Rashi explains that even though we're not asking about making an enactment on putting them on the table because of eating, which is how we've progressed in the argument, we're going to say that you might come to put them together not only on the same table but also into the same pot, and that would be eating the Torah level meat from cows and so on. And so putting them together, it means that you're going to come to eat them, and that would be the prohibition. Okay? The Mishnah says further, okay, it's another Mishnah. It says, what kind of table are we talking about? So the Mishnah says we're talking about the table upon which you eat. But the table upon which you organize the foods, one may be put right next to each other without concern. And Rashi says, what's the problem with the same table? Because that's where you're going to, be touching everything, and you're going to eat them together. So the Rambam says the following. He says it's prohibited to put the meat of fowl, like chicken, with cheese onto the same table upon which one is eating. And this is a gezerah, this is an enactment because of the constant presence of doing something wrong. You might come to do things, if you get accustomed to doing this, you might come to do something incorrectly. Because you're going to eat them together, even though the meat with this meat of the fowl is only a rabbinic level and not Torah level. So the Aruch HaShulchan looks at this and he says, so even though it seems on a very simple level, the Talmud is saying to us that you might come to eat the Torah prohibited stuff together, nonetheless, the Rambam is making an important point that we're going to have two Mishnayos that are coming together to say one important thing. Okay, which is that the enactment for the fowl, for chicken or turkey, whatever it was, is a new enactment, and the problem is you might come to become accustomed to behaving this way and cook them together. Okay, so that is one way the Rambam learns it. The Torah learns the sugya a little bit differently, and he says that you can't have meat and dairy on the same table, even if that meat comes from venison or from fowl. And you also can't put them on the same table with cheese, so that way you don't come to eat them together. But if you come to organize them onto a pot, if you come to organize them on a table where they're just in the pots, we're not eating, that's okay. Okay, so that is a way, a slightly different way in which the Rishonim learn this sugya. So why do we not allow them to be on the same table? So we've seen a couple of opinions. Rashi says the reason is that you might come to eat them together, and they'll touch each other, right? And put them in your mouth together. So Rashi is because they might come to touch each other and then put them in your mouth next to each other. Okay, so that's what it is. You might put them in your mouth. The Ran says that the problem is putting the chicken and milk together, because you're going to then come eat cheese with meat. So it's an oopsie situation. I might think, okay, well, if I can have chicken on the table and I can have milk on the table, well, then I might think I can have cheeseburgers. Okay, so he's saying that the interpretation is that you're going to eat something worse. So that's why it is more problematic. The Rashba understands the Gemara that if I permit you to take meat and milk on the same table, the concern is I'm going to throw them into the boiling pot. Okay, and that's also what the Chachmas Adam brings down as the reason. So we see that the later opinions quote sources all over the place. In the Kreisi Uplesi, Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz writes in the Plesi, he says that the Rambam and the Beis Yosef and is quoting Rav Yosef only. And because Rav Yosef is the one that seems to come up with the approach that doesn't have us making numerous layers of enactments, rabbinic enactments. It's only one gezerah. And so that's why he chooses that opinion when we read that in the Gemara. However, for Abaye, which the Ran is quoting over here, if I say that a problem is going to throw them into the same boiling pot, I mean, even if I throw chicken and milk into the same pot, it's only a rabbinic one, and I'm making layers upon layers of rabbinic ones. Okay, so the question is, are we worried about a cup of milk or even a bottle of milk that's on the table? Is that the problem, or is it whether or not I might come to eat them together? I might accidentally eat them together when they're cold. Okay, or I might eat them raw. Okay, so for example, according to Rashi's opinion, you might think that they might come to touch each other. So as long as it's sealed, it might seem to be okay. But according to the Ron, for example, if you're eating at the table, even having a closed bottle might seem to be problematic. And so too, if I had on the table from which I'm eating, if the food is cold, so according to Rashi, the problem is I'm going to touch them to each other and put them in my mouth. But the Ron, right, if I'm not ready to eat it, if it's cold, then that would be another problem, because it seems to be very small differences, but the interests all line up slightly differently. Okay, so normally we don't prohibit such things. So why is this not considered stacking gezeros? So normally the rabbis take the opinion that one is not allowed to stack gezeros. So the Ron asks this question, and he says, every time that we make this an enactment, we need to make sure that it's only one level of defense against the Torah law. So he says, in our case, we were prohibiting the rabbinic prohibitions in order to fulfill a prohibition about eating certain things together. So why can't you have chicken and milk on the same table? Because you might come to eat cheese with that, okay? And also you might think that you could go ahead and have meat with the cheese. And so we don't want you to think that you can have all these things together. So that way you would not come to cross a line with eating. And so that's why it's all considered one big enactment. Don't eat them together. Okay? And a number of people say that this is the most obvious opinion, cited by the Lavush and the Kaf HaChaim as the most valid opinion. Going back to the Rashba for a second, so it's having it together because you might throw them into the hot pot again. And so in that case, it's not really any type of level of prohibition. It's a prohibition to prevent you from becoming accustomed to eating foods together, and I might throw them in something hot to warm them up. And that prohibition is not the eating part of the Basar B'chalav, but the cooking part of Basar B'chalav. Okay, so that's different than the Ron. The Ron was the eating part, and the Rash was the cooking part. The Taz writes something else. He says that even though when I eat them together, there's no Torah prohibition. All right, so he's not so happy with the Ron, and cooking together is really only a problem with cooking together. Hello, Rashba. He says so. Therefore, the reason why this isn't multiple levels of enactments, not gezeras on top of gezeras, is because in this situation where it's so strict that we're so worried about you coming to be accustomed to doing a sin, in this situation we make extra layers of protection. That's what the Taz's answer is. Okay, so the whole point is that since I don't want you to come and eat them together, I can make as many levels of that as I want. So he says it's not the case, but that's his opinion, and the Pri Megadim agrees with that opinion. Okay, now let's say you're in your waiting period between Basar B'chalav. Okay, you had meat and you have to wait and you want to have dairy, but can you sit next to somebody who's eating dairy, right? You had a burger before you came out to somebody else's house and they're having pizza. Can you sit at the same table, or is there a concern I might come to eat pizza? So the Pri Megadim basically points out on this. He says that if you are in your waiting period of 6 hours, which we'll talk about what that looks like in another section, so can you sit at the table with them? Or can you not sit at the table with them? Okay? Because you might eat the pizza. He doesn't say pizza, but something dairy. I said pizza. Now, if you're eating cheese and and the other guy knows that the other guy ate meat, so that would be fine. Okay? Because then you could say that maybe he will keep you from eating meat. Okay? And that's his suggestion. And some people actually, when quoting the Pri Megadim, say he doesn't actually point out that you have to inform them. So this also means that you have to, when you sit down at the table with somebody else who's eating dairy after you're fleishig, you need to sit down and say, I'm fleishig, right? I ate meat. Ani basari, whatever you want to say. Okay? And the Pri Megadim points out that I don't see people who actually do this, and it sounds like you have to actually both be eating actively for this to be a problem. So maybe there's another heter, is that if you're not actually eating, you're not going to take stuff from their food. Okay? So the problem is that when two people are eating together, they're going to share the food and they'll either touch each other, or you might warm them in a pot together, you might do this, you might do that. So that might be a problem. So then the only problem might exist is if the guy who has no status is eating dairy, and you who are fleishig are now eating parv. It might seem that might be prohibited, but he doesn't see a reason to make another level of prohibition at this point. Okay. And let's see. There are other poskim like Yad Ephraim and Tshuva Me'ava and Kanfeyona. They all write down that one may be lenient in these cases. Okay. Let's see. So people who are eating are now also working. Let's say you're eating and working at the same time. You're not sitting at the table. So is there a problem of maybe you will walk around and eat something that they all have out there? Okay? And so in this situation, that might be okay. So for example, if you're passing around hors d'oeuvres, there might be reason to be lenient with passing around some meat and some dairy, even though we don't do that, because you're not sitting at the same table. So someone might know, eat the meat second, have the dairy ones first. So that's one possibility. Or a person can warn you and say, listen, we're done. We're finishing up the dairy stuff now. So if you want to eat that, eat it now. Otherwise, we're putting it away and you can't bring it back out. Okay? And so there's reasons to be lenient if people can remind each other. In the Sefer Badi Shulchan, my favorite Chomer Sefer, he says that this opinion that we've mentioned is repeated a few different times, and so the problem is whether or not you are tasting something or if you're going to be eating something. And so therefore he says that if the prohibition on the cheese after meat is not as strong of a prohibition as the Mishnah's mention of not eating on the same table, so maybe these things aren't of the same level of strictness. And so therefore it seems like one could go ahead and still be around others who are eating dairy, like cheese, within the 6 hours, even though you might come to eat, because there's just no clear prohibition on it, and we don't want to go ahead and add an extra one. And especially because there are a number of people who hold that if you just had chicken, some people were lenient about the 6 hours altogether, even though we don't paskin that way. And so therefore, as long as you are finished, at such times, if you have not said Birchas Hamazon on your meat meal, then you shouldn't be around other people who are eating dairy, because you still might come to eat dairy. Okay, and so that's what he says. That's his big chiddush. Okay, let's see let's take a look over here for a second, that if it's meat and dairy that are the problem, okay, or if it's other types of prohibition. So let's say someone's eating something that's not something that you would normally eat. Okay, so having things together on the same table is only when you would certainly eat them. But if people are not going to eat them, then that would be fine. Okay, so for example, if you're sitting next to a non-Jew and eating something that's not kosher, okay, and you're having kosher meat, this prohibition doesn't apply. Now, there are cases, for example, that if a person, let's say, accept upon themselves some type of stringency not to eat something, then there's the Rush who says that you shouldn't sit down on the table where that thing is being eaten, because you might eat them unless maybe the people don't like each other, he won't share with you. So we'll learn more about that in the second halacha here about the familiarity issue. But that the idea is that if you sit down with a non-Jew, for example, and let's say it's Pesach and you're not eating chametz and he's eating chametz, right? So in those situations, the reason why it might be a problem is because you're normally eating bread all year long, and even though this is a non-Jew and his bread usually isn't kosher, if you're someone who doesn't normally stay away from pas akum, that might be okay. However, we don't hold that way. We hold that you shouldn't eat in that situation because you might forget and eat some chametz on that day. And so also there might be little crumbs that could drop in, and so it's not the same thing as taking a little bit. Crumbs could fly your way, so it's even worse. So that's something else to be considered in that case. So in a case of where it's just meat and milk, in that case, it's only going to be when people are familiar with each other and not when they're unfamiliar. So we'll learn about that in Halacha Beis here, but for right now we're going to focus more on Halacha Aleph. So the reason why you can't have something on your table with another person unless you know for a fact that you are aware you shouldn't be eating it. So if you know he's not Jewish, then you know for a fact that his food is not kosher, and that would be okay, with the exception being chametz on Pesach. However, if it was, let's say, two Jewish people and one person only eats pas Yisrael and the other person eats pas akum, you might have to put something in between you to let you know that you shouldn't eat from their bread because you are one who stays away from it. Okay, so therefore we follow the lenient opinion of the Shach to as long as you stay away from most of these things, it's okay. However, some people who eat things like pas akum or gvinas akum, all other things will be okay, with the exception of on Pesach. Sorry, they have leniencies on chalav akum and leniencies on pas akum. Gvinas akum would be prohibited. Because, meaning you could eat at the same table, but it's prohibited to eat it. So the Mechaber holds in this case that you shouldn't put them on the same table, and also a table upon which you put the food together. You can arrange them in that case. Okay, so we'll come back to talk about the two achshanaim in the next one. And so what we learned so far in this case is a few interesting halachas over here. So here's a couple of things. So number one, if you have cheeses on the table where you're having meat. So we see from the Torah clearly, he brings down from the Gemara that all types of meats are prohibited to be eaten with milk on the same table, and so therefore you can't have them on the table together without putting something between them, which we'll go into more detail in the next seif, in the next halacha over there. Okay, so we saw there's difference of opinion between Rashi and the Ramah and the Ran and the Rashba about why you can do that, and the reason why that's important is to know that be considered of things touching each other. Okay, which according to Rashi, you might come to eat them together, or the Rasha might come to throw them into the same pot together. So if things aren't necessarily eaten right now, or they're not ready to be eaten, like for example the food's cold or whatever it is, there might be reason to be lenient if they're on the same table together. But nonetheless, it's best to just not have the other food out there. Okay, so if you're in a situation where it's a concern, if something you wouldn't normally eat right now, you could rely on those opinions that basically say if you're not eating it right now, or you're not going to eat it because it's cold or it's raw, then you wouldn't have a problem with it being there. Okay, now we learned about if you're in the middle of your 6-hour waiting period, we saw that there's reason to let them know that if you're fleishig and they're having milk, they shouldn't share with you. Then it's okay to eat with them. But if you don't, then you shouldn't do there. However, this is not a strict thing. And we also saw that a person who stays away from certain types of foods that would normally be permitted. So, for example, if you are someone who stays away from pas akum, you only eat pas Yisrael, or you only have chalav Yisrael, and the other person is drinking what would be called chalav akum or chalav stam, you would have to put some type of demarcation line between yourself and them. However, there's no reason if let's say a non-Jew is eating something not kosher that you would have to be worried about that. So if you're eating in a food court and you go to a kosher place and the guy goes to the treif place, that would be fine. And then so that's that understanding over there. Okay, so that's one other thing is that the reason for not putting them together on the same table is because you might come to eat them together, and so therefore, if you have a closed bottle, okay, you should not leave that bottle on the table because you might open it and drink from it. So even though according to Rashi that would seem that you could be lenient, we're going to take that little chumrah from the Ran. So the packaged products, as long as they're on the table, you might come to eat from it. It would be a problem. However, if you know that it's not yours and you'd be stealing with somebody by eating it, that might be a reason to be lenient. But we'll learn about that in the second halacha when we meet next time. Thank you for joining us in our review of the laws of Basar Chalav and not having them on the same table while eating. Until next time.